Welcome back. Exotix Capital, an international research organization based in London, visited Nigeria recently, where they met a mixture of private and public sector participants. And one of its key findings is that there were no real surprises on the ground, rather a confirmation of a fragile recovery. Let's talk to a member of the team that visited and a senior economist at Exotix Capital, Christopher Delman, to tell us more about these findings and their recommendations. Good afternoon, Christopher. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thank you for having me.
So you titled your report, Nigeria, Fragile Economy, Positive Outlook, and of course a buy recommendation. How much fragility and where are the growth levels?
I think there's still quite a bit of fragility in the recovery. In fact, if we look at the latest GDP figures available for Q3 of 2017, the non-oil economy was still growing at negative rates. This suggests that the entirety of the recovery so far was driven by a rebound in oil production. If production numbers were to decrease again, it would put tremendous strain on economic growth to the point where we could see again negative growth rates. We think this is unlikely, however, and project positive growth going forward. In terms of levels, there's also quite a bit of disagreement. My expectation is that we'll likely see growth of around 1.8% in 2018, which is slightly more pessimistic than both the World Bank and Bloomberg, who are projecting growth rates between 2.5% and 3%.
Now, you expect to cut in Nigeria's monetary policy rate in the second half of the year. By how much?
That's right. We previously discussed how the monetary policy rate would unlikely to be cut until inflation fell to around 12%. We do not expect to see such a decline throughout 2018, but through our conversations with both the public and private sector, as well as our own models, we are now projecting a rate cut of around 1% to 2% from the current 14% in the second half of 2018. This would likely be done in hopes of stimulating economic growth prior to the 2019 election.
Now, you noted that the country's multiple FX regime remains opaque and ultimately harmful to the economy. What further FX tinkering do you advise?
That's right. In the near term, I don't think I would recommend any additional tinkering in the FX regime as a result of relative success and stability that we have seen in the NAFEX INE window. We have seen huge inflows of dollar liquidity into the market over the past 10 months, and the current rate of 360 naira to the dollar is very closely aligned with both the parallel rate as well as a fair value of the currency on a real effective exchange rate basis. On these grounds, we suggest that doing little to shock the current system is probably the best course of action in the near term. Over the longer term, we certainly hope that we'll see further convergence of the various rates into a single floating or at least less managed rate that has fewer distortionary effects on the economy.
You did mention, of course, the 2019 elections. We all know that Nigeria is preparing for that election. What risks abound, if any?
I think there are quite a few risks at the moment, most of which are currently associated with a great degree of uncertainty in terms of who the likely candidates for the 2019 election actually will be. We have yet to hear from President Buhari about whether he will actually choose to stand again. Given his health concerns, it would be very easy for him to step aside, citing the health concerns as the reason, and to handpick his successor within the APC. I do think that as the election becomes closer and closer, and the PDP has yet to choose an opposition candidate, it will increase the likelihood that Buhari chooses to run, as he will likely see his chances of winning as being even greater. Unfortunately, without knowing who will actually stand for election, it's rather difficult to discuss the potential economic consequences of the election at this point in time. Regardless of who ultimately stands for election, that's Buhari or an opposition candidate from the PDP, we are forecasting some fiscal slippage in the latter half of 2018. What we mean by that is we expect a widening of the budget deficit in the latter half of the year and early into 2019 as a result of pre-election spending. And that will likely cause both, as I mentioned, a widening fiscal deficit, but potentially lead to a small short-term increase in economic growth rates during this period.
All right, thank you very much for your time, Christopher. Christopher Delman is the senior economist at Exotix Capital in London. Now, Madagascar is due to hold elections late this year, and voters will be looking for a leader that can fix the economy and lower the cost of living. The country has spent the last 4 years struggling to recover from the economic stagnation of the 2009 to 2013 political transition. The IMF and other international donors resumed a relationship with Madagascar in 2014 following peaceful elections, but the cash-starved government has been cutting back on infrastructure and social spending, about 90% of the population now living on less than $2 a day.
4 years ago, Malagasy elected a new president, a move that was meant to end years of political stalemate and restore Madagascar's economy. The country has spent the last 4 years struggling to recover from the economic stagnation of the 2009 to 2013 political transition. GDP per capita is just $420, and half of its children suffer from chronic malnutrition.
I no longer send my children to school, and on top of that, I will soon get the electricity bill. I don't know what to do. I don't know what else I should do. My wife is due to give birth soon. I have a lot on my mind because of this.
The government of the current president, who is standing for re-election later this year, says economic recovery is on course, with economic growth standing at 4.2%. But many in the capital say economic gains have not trickled down to ordinary people, as inflation remains at 7.8%, driving the cost of living to an all-time high. The International Monetary Fund and other international donors broke ties or cut aid payments to the Indian Ocean island after a coup in 2009, but resumed them after a peaceful presidential vote in late 2013. But the cash-starved government has been cutting back on infrastructure and social spending in recent years, with about 90% of the population now living on less than $2 a day. Critics blame the current economic woes on bad leadership and a government that has failed to show any effort to help citizens weather the harsh economic times.
Those who are in power are not concerned about the interests of the nation, and they're not concerned about the type of government or country that we should have. There has never been a public discussion about it. It's only a minority that dominates. Those in power only look after their own personal interests.
As the country prepares to hold elections later this year, the World Bank says political risk remains one of the biggest threats to Madagascar's economy.
There is a big challenge ahead for the country. It needs, the history is such that Madagascar has had many crises that have interrupted growth cycle in the past. And thus Madagascar needs to prove itself first, not just to the international community, but first it needs to prove to itself that it can have elections, stable elections, peaceful election in late 2018 that will enable them to continue on implementing reforms, economic reforms, investing for the long term of their country.
The government says it wants to hold down inflation to single digits and forecast an average inflation rate of 7.8% in 2018, down from an expected 8.1% in 2017.
And with that, we draw the curtain on today's edition of the program and, of course, for the week. Thank you very much for being part of it. I'm Chimezi Obi Iwago.